Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We're going to get started here shortly. Assalamu alaikum, Shahid. How's it going?
Walaikum salam. I'm doing well, Sammy. How are you, brother?
I'm good. I'm good. Maybe we can wait a few more minutes to get started. We allowed like around 5 for folks to get into the Zoom. We opened a little late.
Okay. Sounds good. Thanks so much for pulling this gathering together. I'm grateful for the chance to connect with folks.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, again, my pleasure. Looking forward to questions too. I'll try to, maybe we could talk about this, but I'd hope to, pause as we go for questions, or would you rather I sort of spiel and then pause for questions later?
We can pause and do questions like throughout.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, so maybe while we're waiting, we can do quick intros. I can start. So one of our co-moderators, Sidald Hassan, is a master's student in human nutrition at Columbia University starting this fall. And she's a recent graduate of public policy from Princeton University. And her work on campus previously was as president of the Princeton Muslim Student Association. She was sexual harassment and assault advisor. She was a resources and education share liaison. Excuse me, those things are put together. And she's co-led an immersion trip through the Breakout Princeton program on the topic of mental health. She's currently spearheading the End Racism FCPS effort in her hometown of Frederick, Maryland, and is working with the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University at the Just Data Lab on researching how COVID-19 impacts, how COVID-19 affects prisoners throughout the nation, and is a deeply rooted emerging leader fellow through the Muslim Wellness Program. She's also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America's newly formed Muslim Caucus.
Thank you for that intro, Sammy. And to introduce Sammy, he's a rising senior in public health at Brown University, a member of Brown Muslim Student Association, Brown University Student for Justice in Palestine, Providence Democratic Socialists of America, steering committee member of the DSA Palestine Solidarity Working Group, member of the DSA Muslim Caucus as well, New Orleans DSA, a youth organizer with Palestine Youth Movement, and he also works as a COVID-19 case investigator with the Rhode Island Department of Health. And most notably, he formerly worked as a field organizer and Muslim constituency organizer for the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2020.
Thanks, Sidad. And we're also going to be joined by a few folks who we're going to introduce now. The first of whom is Siham al-Lafari. And Siham is a senior at California State University, Sacramento, who's currently majoring in biomedical sciences. And she's representing Sacramento State as the treasurer of the Muslim Women Coalition. And Siham is going to be looking through the Q&A for questions related to the discussion topic that we're talking about. So please feel free to use the Q&A chat box. She will be looking through it and hopping into the discussion when necessary to prompt us if we're not covering a topic that folks want to talk about.
And next, someone else who really was fruitful in helping this event come together was Abdulhamid Arbab. He is a rising sophomore studying public policy at Princeton University. He is the co-president of Princeton Masjid, which is the Muslim Advocates for Social Justice group on campus. He also currently works at CARE New York in their organizing and is also currently a member of the newly formed DSA Muslim Caucus. He's been helping out with the event and organizing and also being one of the event moderators for the chats. It's the same capacity as Siham. So.
Yeah, and then last but definitely not least, Bilal Woori and Sean Jaffrey, sorry. Bilal is a rising senior studying psychology at Harvard. He serves as vice president of the Harvard Islamic Society, mashallah. Sean is an anthropology major in his junior year at the University of Houston and the vice president of Ahlul Bayt student organization at UH. So both Bilal and Sean are going to be joining us today as chat moderators. So please keep it clean in the chat. But I don't think we're going to have any problems with that, inshallah. And the last thing I want to say is we're going to be joined by our co-sponsoring organizations. So that's Brown MSA, Princeton Muslim Advocates for Social Justice, Columbia MSA, Arizona State University MSA, Harvard Islamic Society, the Muslim Caucus of the DSA, Georgia State Ahlul Bayt Association, University of Houston ABSO, UC Berkeley, Thaqalain Islamic Society, Rutgers AFSA, Sacramento State Women's Association, ABBA, UI, UC, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and University of Nevada, Las Vegas, MSA. That was a lot, but very happy that everyone's here because it was great bringing all the groups together, and mashallah, the work's been really fulfilling.
So just to talk a bit about how this event will run, we want to include a quick disclaimer that this is a conversation specifically on the current moment, and that this is a conversation about how us as Muslims can be involved in advocating for real change. This is a conversation that is less spiritual in nature and more about how spirituality and religion may inform politics in this era and how that may have personally informed Shahid specifically. So to do a quick intro about Shahid, so in our effort to have a conversation about promoting change in the world around us as Muslims in politics and other spheres of change making, we have invited Shahid Buttar, who is a Muslim U.S. congressional candidate for CA12. He has made the great feat of being the first Democratic primary challenger against current House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in over 30 years. In his past work, Shahid has worked in both San Francisco and Washington as a legal advocate, nonprofit leader, grassroots organizer, poet, and musician. His wide-ranging work reflects a commitment to intersectional feminism, democratic socialism, international human rights, racial justice, the Green New Deal, single-payer healthcare, and more. He also worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation between 2008 and 2009 as a director of grassroots advocacy, where he worked to end warrantless government surveillance. And now Sammy will introduce the first discussion speaker.
Yes. So now that we're through all the intros, so Shahid, like looking at the current crisis, and that's from like what's happening with the coronavirus, from the Black Lives Matter movement, the federal government response or the lack thereof, running for office like during these times, and then Trump inflaming all of these crises. I guess if you could talk to us about what your theory of change is on all these different existential issues that we face. And also what you'd like to share with the audience before we launch into a more moderated discussion about, your campaign and the work you aim to do. And we're like giving you about like 15 minutes for this. Feel free to go a little under, a little over. But yeah, you got the floor.
Thank you, Sammy, and thank you, Sarad, for the gracious introduction and the chance to be with you all today. Theory of change in the moment we're in, I see very much the future of our republic at risk, and at risk of fascism imposed not only by the GOP, but tacitly facilitated by the supposed opposition party. And this isn't a new fear to me, and it's not a new, frankly, threat in the context of our republic's history. The United States has been steeped, unfortunately, in institutional racism since even before the republic's founding. And I see my role as an advocate as one standing on the shoulders of people who've come before, and one hopefully moving the arc of the moral universe closer towards the justice that we have long been seeking. I do see very much our contemporary movement standing in the footsteps of movements that came before, everything from the civil rights movement in the 1960s, before that the movement to, for instance, gain suffrage for women, the anti-slavery and abolition movement, which I would just note sought a set of objectives which even today remain unfulfilled. I do feel called on to remind every audience I have a chance to speak with recently that industrial slavery in the United States is alive and well, not only survived the Civil War, but is worse today, at least in terms of the number of people enslaved legally, than at the height of the antebellum South. And that can be a disturbing fact to grapple with in a country that sings odes to living in the land of the free and the home of the brave at sporting events. I suspect that many Americans don't understand what the word free means anymore. I think we have been so acculturated to not understand liberty that it's almost like, asking a fish what is air instead of the water in which they're immersed. And in this country in particular, I've seen over the course of the last 20 years in particular, any number of horrors emerge. Just to give you a sense of who I am and how I relate to these issues. When I was 16 years old, my family lost our house to foreclosure. At this point, we'd had this sort of American dream immigration experience. We moved to the country in 1976. I was 2 years old. My father did well for himself and the family. We moved into a big house and then we lost it just as I was graduating from high school. I started college at 17. I finished college at 26. So I started early. I finished somewhat late, relative to the norm. I spent 10 years in between, basically pursuing a career in Chicago in financial services. I worked at a series of banks, running numbers, designing presentation graphics. It's how I got through night school to get my degree. I came out to the Bay Area first in 2000 to study law at Stanford. I had an opportunity to teach there before I graduated. And in the 20 years since then, I've basically fought for our rights in both coasts. And I've seen Democrats as well as Republicans line up to facilitate not just the interests of the 1% and not just corporate resource extraction, killing the future and robbing from it. But I want to particularly just emphasize the emergence of bipartisan authoritarianism in the United States, the bipartisan willingness to turn a blind eye to domestic mass surveillance, the bipartisan willingness to turn a blind eye to human rights abuses, abuses of principles that our nation once proudly fought a world war to establish, rights that are guaranteed around the planet thanks to our forebears. And that's a legacy that we today sully by allowing open, unapologetic human rights abusers to run national security agencies. I see also particularly implicated in this current political moment, the repudiation of paramilitarized policing and a police industrial slavery complex, which connects everything from schools to police, to for-profit prisons, to, frankly, most remaining vestiges of manufacturing capacity in the United States. When we look at these issues through the lens of authoritarianism, a different picture emerges than the one of partisan gridlock that we are inculcated and taught to, I dare say, falsely internalize as the political landscape. We are told by any number of media sources and our supposed leaders that Democrats and Republicans are fighting tooth and nail in Washington. In fact, they work together hand in hand, particularly to fleece the public, and that's not new. I would particularly just here note the intersection of our longstanding military industrial complex and the looming and mounting global climate catastrophe that it has helped accelerate. And we don't in the movement often connect these issues, but intersectionality to me reflects not only the intersectionality of oppression and the intersectionality of liberation, but also the intersectionality among our social crises. Most of the particular crises that our communities confront relate to other underlying causes. The role of capital in our civilization is one of those underlying causes, and the co-optation of the Democratic Party by capital is another one of those underlying causes. I see in terms of my theory of change, I see the outside-inside collaboration as a crucial facet of liberation. We can't pretend that voting is enough, just like we can't pretend that activism is enough. It takes all parts of the equation. We have to write, we have to teach, we have to explore, we have to mobilize, we have to build and connect, we have to reach out, we have to demonstrate solidarity, we have to win elections, we have to legislate, and we have to overpower corporate centrists that are strangling the future. And what I'm doing in our campaign to end Nancy Pelosi's career and liberate San Francisco's voice in the House is one piece of that puzzle. Just to set the stage in terms of other parts of the puzzle that I've had a chance to explore and examine very carefully, my very first acts politically were acts of direct action, nonviolent resistance to US militarism. We shut down a Lockheed Martin plant with a few hundred allies from across the Bay Area in the spring of 2003, not long after Bush had invaded Iraq. The morning after the invasion, I was part of a movement of 20,000 other San Franciscans. We laid siege nonviolently to the city of San Francisco using our bodies to block all the highway exit ramps. And we did that to pull the corporate plug on the invasion. And we held the city for a day and a half nonviolently. And it was that vision of an uprising, that experience of seeing what people power looks like, that helped me better understand the principle of popular sovereignty and how it relates not just to the basis for democratic legitimacy in our republic, but quite literally the recipe for how we find our way out of this bipartisan emergent fascism. And I think the key there is people power, not necessarily laying siege to major cities, but certainly people finding each other and taking advantage of our shared opportunities to raise our voices, building movements. And I see that emerge in any number of ways, from the local mutual aid projects that have proliferated around the country, responding particularly to the pandemic, to the direct action campaigns that I've been a part of for the last 20 years, to the issue advocacy campaigns that have sprung up around the country. As an anti-surveillance advocate, I've had any number of chances to observe and inform and work with those kinds of groups. And I see the civic engagement of a new generation of Muslims as part of, frankly, the liberatory equation to liberate the future from the constraints of the past. I'll try to make this not too sharp, but about 20 years ago, our community was silenced very dramatically. And I founded the program to combat racial and religious profiling at Muslim Advocates because I saw our community as canaries in a constitutional coal mine. I watched the FBI infiltrate mosques around the country. I resisted that. My principal antagonist at the time was the FBI director. His name was Bob Mueller. A lot of other people have come to know his name in a very different context in the years since. But under the Bush administration, he was the FBI director overseeing the frontal assault on First Amendment rights of free exercise. And it was frankly worse than that. It wasn't just Muslims. And I'll come back to this in just a second. Another target of the very early suppression of dissent and constitutional rights, at least when I say early, I'm not going back to the Palmer raids here, because frankly, the restraints on dissent by our national security agencies go back to their very earliest days of the agencies themselves. But I just mean to say, let's say going back to the Bush administration. The other particular, and even the Clinton administration before that, the other principal target for FBI and government neutralization efforts in the 80s and 90s were environmental rights groups and animal rights groups. Environmental activists were the very first people in the United States, long before the 9/11 attacks, prosecuted for terror offenses related to speech crimes. And there are dozens of them to this day languishing in federal prisons as convicted terrorists. And their worst crimes would be legitimately described as vandalism, or in the very worst cases, arson, but certainly not terrorism. And these are white Americans, predominantly from Washington State and Oregon State, who were motivated by an environmental sensibility in the 90s to take profound care to avoid any risk to life in threatening any number of property developments. And that was enough. In fact, the first statute before the Patriot Act here was the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which made dissent challenging, particularly concentrated animal feeding operations and factory farms. It made challenging that paradigm an act, not just a crime, but an act of terror. And that was before the 9/11 attacks, when our community became very centrally in the government's crosshairs. And the reason I'm depicting this history in particular is twofold. I want to first note that we are not the first community to have been silenced. I want to also note that one reason I'm so inspired by young people of various kinds today is that we are shrugging off the yoke of the limits that restrained our forebears. And I see in a young generation of Muslims a willingness, a boldness that frankly was driven out of too many older people in our community. Now, I want to dig in particularly this might be chasing a rabbit, and I'd invite questions if people have questions here, but I want to particularly just dig in on the word Islamophobia and the unfortunate consequence of saying it, which is to say, every time we use the word Islamophobia, we do the work of the right wing for it. And that will sound like a hard thing for many Muslims to grip. And I will say it again, it's not helpful to ever use the word, and I'm going to explain why. The first is that it underplays the threat. It downplays the threat. The threat is not fear of Muslims. The threat is fascism. And fascism, we are just one in a litany of communities that the fascists will eviscerate given the opportunity. And if we say that the problem is fear of us, we marginalize both ourselves and the movement to combat the threat, because the threat is much bigger than fear of Muslims. It's like describing an elephant as the tusk. And yes, it is the part of the tusk that is facing our community, but the nature of fascism is that it has many tusks. They face out in all directions. And if we name its tusks as just the one that is facing us, we marginalize the opportunity to name the threat and build coalitions to end it. A further insinuation, an unfortunate insinuation of the word Islamophobia, is that it denominates the issue again as fear of Muslims, when frankly, the fear, if anything, is of communities that have been marginalized long before Muslims came to find ourselves in the precise crosshairs. And I do want to particularly note the unique experience of African-American Muslims who intersectionally have been subject to any number of compounding abuses, marginalizations, and threats, frankly. And when we as Muslims call the problem Islamophobia, we overlook the extent to which the problem is an intersecting set of evils. It is militarism and capitalism in the service ultimately of racism. It was Dr. King who gave us this framework, and Brother Malcolm maybe didn't elucidate it in the same terms, but he absolutely confronted it in very much those same terms, to an equal, if not greater degree, frankly, than Dr. King himself. And this principle of the intersectional danger of capitalism and militarism fueling and giving a voice to an institutional infrastructure to racism. That's the story of our criminal injustice system. That's the story of our military industrial resource extraction, exploitation complex. That's the story of all of the abuses that we aim to shrug off in the year 2020. And the complicity of corporate Democrats in all of these abuses is what drives me to run for the 12th Congressional District seat here in California. Again, I'm looking forward to answering folks' questions and to addressing any other particular areas of the issues that y'all want me to touch on.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask a little bit more about your work on both coasts and ask you to elaborate more on what you see in the intersectionality of oppression, as you mentioned earlier, and focus on the topic of Black Lives Matter. And I want to ask a question that I really want to hear your thoughts on, given the nature of our audience, young Muslims interested in the people's power. So in the Muslim community, there's often a reluctance to address anti-Black racism, with folks often pointing to a colorblind society or using rhetoric that promotes a direct erasure of the Black Muslim experience. This often looks like pointing to increased presence of police officers or surveillance officers in Muslim spaces without proper reflection on how that negatively impacts Black Muslims, particularly under the guise of safety. And as you explained in the context of Islamophobia. So in your work as both an organizer and advocate for racial justice, what have you personally done and suggest should be done by others to dispel the rampant anti-Black racism in our Muslim circles and in your communities? And how do you, in your own work, uplift groups like the Black Muslim COVID Coalition to show how racism directly affects folks in the Muslim community, even along health lines?
So lots of questions there. Maybe I'll just start with the work on both coasts and BLM. Is that a fair place to start? The movement for Black Lives has been denominated in those terms since the Ferguson uprising, and been frankly working in solidarity with its aims since well before the uprising. In 2001, a proposed piece of legislation nearly passed Congress. It was called the End Racial Profiling Act. It has frankly not been seen since. So just a quick vignette here. This is 2010. Summer of 2010. So Obama's been in office for about half a year. I'm in a meeting with the then chair of the House Judiciary Committee. John Conyers was the figure. It was his chief of staff leading the meeting. And there were a number of civil rights organizations represented in the room, including the one that I was leading at the time, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. And I asked the chief of staff for John Conyers, I said, when will you reintroduce IRPA, the End Racial Profiling Act? And the response in the meeting was, we are waiting for the administration's support. That is to say, Congress, the Congressional Black Caucus, was waiting for the support of the first Black president for the End Racial Profiling Act. Obama, mind you, had come to the White House. His principal achievement in the Illinois State Senate before becoming the president was the passage of a bill to end racial profiling in Illinois. 8 years later, we were still waiting for the administration's support. And I've watched that pattern unfold entirely too many times. In terms of the work on both coasts, just to focus on the East Coast first, from 2010 until 2015, I led an organization called the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. My work then started with synthesizing a civil rights platform, a set of restrictions on police departments that city councils could effectuate to do everything from ending profiling, not just in the war on terror and the war on dissent, but also in the war on immigrants and on the war on drugs. To recognize the intersectional nature of our community's challenges vis-a-vis local police departments was sort of the essence of this phase of the work. And just to take this further, this is not unlike my analysis of the unfortunate insinuations of the word Islamophobia. If we step back from any community's experience, we recognize the context of the struggles that we confront in very different terms. For instance, if we think about immigrant rights or the rights of dissidents or the rights of communities to be free from paramilitary police effectuating a drug war as separate struggles, we will lose the extent to which, and we will overlook the extent to which there is a common institutional antagonist to all of our communities, whether it's the war on terror or the war on drugs or the war on immigrants, whether it's Black people, brown people, or a different shade of brown people, it's always the insert here police department that is at the other end of the spear. And so if we change the lens from looking at particular communities and looking at particular abuses to looking for common institutional antagonists, this gets back to your first question around the theory of change, it unlocks a great many opportunities. And so the intersectional social change platform that I was promoting at the time, it was called the Local Civil Rights Restoration Act. And again, we were promoting this at the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. It became the object of campaigns around the country, local coalitions, grassroots coalitions, intersectional coalitions that included racial justice organizations, that included peace and justice organizations, that included immigrant rights groups and student groups, even libertarian organizations in some parts of the country that were fighting shoulder to shoulder for enforceable restrictions on their local police departments. The high watermark of that campaign, while I live here in San Francisco, was actually back on the East Coast. Providence, Rhode Island is the city that adopted the most components of the measure. The Police Community Relations Act, I believe is what it was finally called. At one point, it was called the Community Safety Act. And I know that the branding of the bill became controversial in itself, but I think it was summer, maybe fall of 2017, that Providence adopted this set of reforms that did everything from mandate data collection about the racial impacts of policing activities. Incidentally, that's a key component of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that just passed the House 3 years later. The Providence bill also included due process protections to ensure that young people that were placed on gang injunctions had notice of their inclusion and an opportunity to get off those associational based, frankly, constitutional violations by police departments. The Providence Act had any number of other components, including a requirement for the police departments establish reasonable suspicion of a criminal offense before conducting intelligence operations. That's a reform that's only been adopted in a handful of other places around the country, and most of which I had a chance to work with coalitions seeking those reforms. They include Berkeley, California, which adopted that measure, the reasonable suspicion predicate for intelligence gathering was adopted in Berkeley, California in 2011, after the Berkeley Police Department was found to have been complicit in a police crackdown targeting the local Occupy movement. We see across, again, each of these struggles, whether it's dissidents, whether it's immigrants, whether it's Black people, whether it's brown people, whether it's any people, when it's police on the other end, we share an interest in restraining them. And so that was very the essence of my work at BORDC. Again, we organized coalitions coast to coast. I've done a lot of writing around the movement as a journalist and advocate. So some of that work included reporting on the continuing parts of the uprising, particularly in St. Louis, Missouri. Ferguson got a lot of attention in 2014. The uprising there continued. It continues today. I think the last time I had a chance to write about it was probably 2016, 2017. But by that point, the cameras had all left. The national lens had frankly moved on to other cities, yet the movement on the ground remained very, very active. And, you know, I like to reframe issues that other people see and mistake the significance of. And so, you know, just like when Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore, I was on the ground in Baltimore the day particularly that the prosecutor there, Carolyn, I believe was her first name, Mosby, announced the charges against the officers that killed Freddie Gray. And there was a curfew that was imposed in the wake of the resistance there, and had a chance to write about that curfew, explaining that it's not a curfew, that's martial law. Just like when we talk about police body cameras, that's not accountability, that's surveillance. And we should recognize it as such. And the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, at the same time that it includes some measures that I have long supported, like ending qualified immunity, like creating a registry of violent police, it also includes measures that undermine civil rights, like inflating police budgets to expand the use of police body cameras, which put people in prison instead of holding police accountable. And we could unpack all the reasons why in a minute. That was also work that I sort of started at the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. So yeah, there was a work on both BLM. Let's just to touch on that too. Had the, I don't know if opportunity is the right word here, but I was in a BLM demonstration, and it's all intersectional, right? So it was immigrant rights and Black Lives Matter. This was December 2014. We marched from Columbia Heights to DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., and an irate lawyer who represents hedge funds drove his SUV into a crowd. I ended up jumping on his hood to avoid being maimed, took him to court years later, and not very long ago had an opportunity to establish with a jury in Washington that he had lied about using his car as a battering ram, that he drove into the crowd, that he hit me with his SUV, and the jury gave me $0 in damages, just to close the loop there. So you know, I've put my body very much on the line and understand what is at stake here. Rewinding the tape from the resistance to one reason why I care so much about police accountability. When I lived in Chicago, I was 16 to 26 during the years that I lived in Chicago. And about halfway through my time there, I just moved to Rogers Park. It's a neighborhood on the north side of Chicago along the border of Evanston. And about 3 months after I'd moved to the neighborhood, I and both of my housemates at the time were all mugged by a gang of police officers about 4 blocks from our house. And I went through the exercise of going to the police precinct. You know, they gave me a binder full of their like pictures, and I went through and I found the cops. And of course, there's no notice or process or anything that happens afterward. I don't know if they were ever held responsible. I don't know if they were still mugging people, you know, in a different precinct the next week. But I've seen the corruption of police officers up close and personal. I've seen the corruption of the law open on the books. That's precisely why the political theater of kneeling in kente cloth is insufficient and inadequate for this moment. It's precisely why I dare say the presidency or the candidacy for the White House of architects of the 1994 crime bill are insufficient and inadequate. We are living in a moment when too many Americans have been complicit and deferential to a system of mass human rights abuses that we have the opportunity to end. And I do want to make very clear that while any number of horrors might precede us and appear entrenched to any degree, the future is up to us. We constitute it in the present, and we need not defer to the past.
Thank you for elaborating on that. I just wanted to quickly follow up and ask more specifically about the Muslim community and like your work in uplifting Black Muslim voices, because I think that is especially important given that there aren't enough spaces that where are Muslim predominant and that try and pass the microphone to Black voices. So have you personally done that sort of work? And just like to keep it kind of short since we want to stick to our agenda and talk about the other crises. But yeah, can you talk a little bit more specifically about your work with Black Muslim communities? Because I understand that like the Black Lives Matter movement is intersecting with that, but yeah, elaborating more specifically on that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I've done more work in gay Muslim communities and Black communities than I have with Black Muslim communities, just to answer the question very discreetly. I haven't done a lot of work in Muslim communities, frankly. I mean, I am a Muslim, and I think a lot of Muslims look to my voice as one, reflecting our community's interests. Most of my work has been outside Muslim communities. I've certainly spoken at any number of congregations and any number of spaces. In terms of the voices that I've particularly lifted up, it's been more gay Muslims who were fighting and clamoring for civil rights. My very first cases as a young lawyer in 2003 and 2004 were vindicating the rights of gay Americans. And in that era, I found myself, if anything, often fighting Muslims over what civil rights mean, because at the same time, if today we're experiencing an expanding awareness of intersectionality, at the time, frankly, that awareness had not even taken root. And I spent a lot of time trying to explain to Muslims who didn't see gay rights as a Muslim issue or didn't understand intersectionality why marriage equality for gay couples is a civil rights issue, as much a Muslim issue as issues that might be of interest to our own particular community. So in terms of underserved voices, that's really been where more my focus has been. And I just realized too, when you asked me before about my work on both coasts, I emphasized the East Coast. Just to close the loop there on the West Coast, I had a chance to advocate here in San Francisco 10 years ago to try to get the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force out of the San Francisco Police Department. More recently, I advocated for the nation's first ban on municipal face surveillance technology that was adopted by our Board of Supervisors here in San Francisco in the spring of 2019. And that movement has taken root and spread across the country. I'm eager to take that to Washington as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shahid. So if we can kind of shift the conversation a little bit and talk about the health crisis going on right now. So obviously there's a pandemic, and there's also, to add on to that, we have tens of millions who just lost their health insurance, millions more who didn't have it to begin with, and then millions who are also underinsured. So really quick, yes or no answer. Do you support Medicare for all, single payer healthcare?
Yes, of course, absolutely. Any sane person has to at a time like this.
Yes. Yeah. So, okay. So can you tell everyone listening kind of why you support single payer healthcare and what your plan is for getting it through Congress, inshallah? Like, I guess kind of prompting you as well, like, do your Islamic principles come into play surrounding your beliefs about single payer? I know for myself, that's part of the sort of inclination to support it. So if you could just speak to like the reasons why you support single payer, that would be great.
I might do it in reverse order, just to start about the role of Islam for me. Islam doesn't have a great deal for me to do with my politics. And I'll be clear here, my family fled a Muslim country because we were persecuted as heretics. And in Muslim countries, Ahmadis are persecuted because, we recognize that prophecy continues in the world and no people has a monopoly on truth. And that's enough to put us on the wrong side of many traditional conceptions of Islam. And so my family's migration history is very much rooted in a flight from religious dogma to find the freedom to practice, which is frankly what the United States was founded on 250 years ago. And I think there's something very beautiful, frankly, and reflective of a Muslim family coming to the United States to secure religious freedom. And I'm very dedicated and committed to a robust separation between church and state. And my principles politically come from humanist principles that transcend any faith. They are principles that bring all human beings together. And you might say that that in some way is rooted in Islam. I've heard any number of people suggest, for instance, that, like the birds and the sun are Muslim because they submit to the will of the unseen. Similarly, I am very committed to humanist principles that transcend any faith community and transcend any demographic community. I'm committed to people, period. And when that's part of why I am committed to universal healthcare as a matter of right. Just to look at this, not from a current time slice perspective, which is, stepping back from the pandemic. Long before the coronavirus pandemic threatened our civilization and forced people to recognize how senseless it is to treat healthcare like a commodity, we in the United States embraced a predatory for-profit system that is basically a healthcare denial racket. That's what private health insurance and healthcare is. And we have long committed ourselves to extracting every dime that sick people have from their pocket and their bank account and then kicking them into the street, That's been our national policy in the United States going back for decades. Every industrialized country in the world has secured universal health care as a matter of right. Every country in the world, with the exception of ours. And when you look at Medicare for All through that lens, what emerges for me is not a home of the brave and a land of the free. It's a home of the deprived and a land of the resigned and intimidated. We in the United States have been willing to settle for fewer rights than other people in other countries. And if a desire for humanity and fairness or public health weren't enough, I would hope that our own sense of decency and national pride might be implicated here at some point. The Americans factually don't have it as good as people in other countries. And I wish that the bravado that drives our country to do such idiotic things might be mustered here in the service of driving us to actually do something useful for a change and learn from the rest of the world how better to allocate risks. Now, just to dive into the pandemic in the context that it uniquely offers us a new lens to look at this question, it was certainly thoughtless, I dare say vicious in the past to treat healthcare like a commodity good. In an age of contagious pandemic, when your neighbor's health necessarily impacts your own, when your neighbor getting sick could place you or your family at risk, in that context, to treat healthcare as a for-profit commodity good is self-defeating. It is stupid. It's senseless. It needlessly drives people into their graves. And we can simply end that era by joining the rest of the industrialized world and recognizing that public health is a public good. It is a thing in which we all share an interest. You and I, we all share an interest in making sure that our neighbor can get medicine too. And when we realize that, there's something very profound there, because it's not just about healthcare policy. What we recognize when we start to embrace and acknowledge our shared interests and shared goods is a paradigm shift. Our civilization is predicated on competition relentlessly. That's the very essence of capitalism. And the essence of socialism is cooperation in the service of shared objectives and needs. And that's the picture that emerges when we consider the shared interests that we have in protecting public health, in ensuring that our neighbors can get to a doctor, can get the medicine that they need, when we ensure that medicine is available for free at the point of service without copays or deductible, when cost is not a barrier to care, public health outcomes will improve. And we've seen in the world that the cost will go down as well. And when we think about the cost going down, the outcomes improving, that's a no-brainer in itself. There's a whole other way to look at this, and that's the intersectional benefits of Medicare for All. One of them is a jobs boom. There is no stronger stimulus package we could pass than taking off the income statements of every employer, large and small, the need to fund employee health insurance. It's the largest expense for most American businesses. Foreign businesses need not bear that expense. They work at a relative advantage because only American companies have to pay for employee health care. Another intersection, sort of if that's the incentive for businesses to hire more people, liberated from the need to pay for their health care, on the other end of the socioeconomic continuum, we also can anticipate any number of people having a chance to stay in their homes. The leading cause of both bankruptcy and homelessness is medical costs. And there's no good reason for that to be the case. We can make better choices. We can say that sick people will have support from our government. We can say that together we want to ensure that when sick people get sick, that they have a chance to deal with their illness without having to deal with homelessness, without having to deal with their housing costs. Those are choices we could make. People around the world have made those choices. We in the United States have yet to make those choices. And I'm eager to be an agent to effectuate that long overdue choice.
Thank you for that. So related to the topic of health that Sammy introduced and just keeping the Naomi Klein book on fire behind you,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you to elaborate on the environmental crisis. So we see that there are a lot of so-called isolated incidents of racism that affect both people's health and the environment around them. So one of which is most identifiably close to home for you in California, where in southern LA, there was a Delta jet fuel dump that primarily affected those in lower income communities and communities of color. This is also reflective of the water crisis in Michigan and in other states where communities of color, but specifically predominantly Black communities, are struggling to figure out this issue. So how do you hope to bring change in your community as an elected official or as an engaged Muslim American citizen in addressing the broader global environmental crisis, but also in the intersectional issues of racism and health within that context of the environmental crisis?
So here I'll try to start at the end of that too, the intersectional local part of the crisis. So just to be very concrete, there's a Black community here in San Francisco, Hunters Point, which has been relentlessly poisoned by the US Navy for over half a century. The nuclear weapons that we detonated in Japan, the one time in our species history that weapons of mass destruction were used against civilian populations, those bombs were manufactured in San Francisco, in a Black neighborhood that today has asthma and cancer rates among the worst in the world. And in that neighborhood, Hunters Point, they've built, and when I say they, I mean real estate contractors have built hundreds of units of new housing because Nancy Pelosi and a business that she partly owns were responsible for privatizing this land. There's been a fraudulent corporate cleanup. It's an acknowledged Superfund site. And for the last 10 years, there's been a corporate cleanup happening on this land that was found to be fraudulent. And the people in that community, again, one of San Francisco's last Black enclaves, have been clamoring for years for oversight, for clean soil. The people who buy homes in this community, which are frankly, they start at $500,000, just to be clear of the kind of displacement that we've seen already unwind in too many parts of our city and other cities around the country. The people moving into this neighborhood have to sign covenants not to grow anything in the soil because the soil is radioactive. You can't grow tomatoes if you buy one of these new $500,000 homes in Hunters Point. And there's a new lawsuit that's been announced by thousands of community members, current and former police who patrolled the neighborhood, who also have vastly disproportionate health problems, as well as other community voices that have sued the corporate contractor here. Even the Navy is suing the corporate contractor here for poisoning the neighborhood. Now, I've been to any number of community meetings in that neighborhood. I've met with the elected supervisor for that community. Everyone in the neighborhood acknowledges that there's a problem, and everyone in the neighborhood effectively is powerless to do anything about it. The neighborhood has one voice on our board of supervisors, which is the county and city body, basically the city legislature. And there's a challenge to muster consensus in that body. Beyond that, the bigger problem is that the city council, the board of supervisors, has only some authority relative to the space. They can control, for instance, whether to approve building housing on it, but they can't mandate that the Navy do anything. And the Navy ultimately was the source of the problem here, which is to say it's a federal problem. It's a federal source. It will take a federal solution. I'm going to pivot here. This is going to remix your prior question and this one, and then I'll come back to the Green New Deal and climate justice generally. About 3 months ago, an off-duty FBI agent shot an unhoused neighbor of mine about 200 feet from my front door. It was, and he survived, thankfully. It was the survivor is a white man who had intervened when this off-duty FBI agent was harassing an African-American man on the street. And what's interesting about this case, any number of things are interesting about this case, but what I want to focus on is the arc of what happened in its wake. The first community meeting responding to when Tad was shot was organized by the Homeless Youth Alliance. It brought together a few dozen of his friends, community members, mostly unhoused folks who basically were sharing their feelings about feeling at risk. Because when you're unhoused, you don't have walls. I understand this experience. I've grappled with it myself. You were just very much at risk for anyone rolling up on you. And when off-duty FBI agents run around shooting people without identifying themselves or showing their badges, everyone in the entire neighborhood was terrified because it could happen to them too. And it was, for me as an advocate, I've been fighting the FBI for over a decade, to be in that room hearing from people about how terrified they felt personally at the hands of this agency that I'd been fighting for decades as a disembodied institutional problem, but not one that has been up in my face in the way that it has been in my neighbors, was, let's just describe that as an emotionally enlightening experience. The next meeting was called and convened by a number of local leaders, including our elected board, a member of our elected board of supervisors, representative from our district attorney's office, someone from the SF police department. And they all agreed that this was a real problem. This incident, the violence, state violence, needed to be investigated. Someone needed to find out what happened here and do something about it. And it couldn't be anybody in the room because none of them had the power. They were all local officials, which is to say, once we're talking about federal agencies, mayors, local district attorneys, city council members, they can't do anything about it. It takes federal voices. There is one person in San Francisco with the authority to get an answer from the FBI. Her name is Nancy Pelosi. And as far as I know, she's never said a word about this incident once, ever. The third meeting that I went to, our campaign convened in collaboration with DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, San Francisco, and our local Cop Watch group. And in that room, we invited the survivor's family. To my knowledge, it was the first time that they have been heard publicly. They FaceTimed in the survivor himself from his hospital bed, where he directly addressed the group. When we left out of that room, every single person who was in it was signed up for a counter surveillance shift with Cop Watch to monitor not the FBI, but the SFPD. That's the difference between showing up for communities and talking about issues. And I raised that issue because it intersects the racial violence issues. It starts to get your question around like representation of Black communities. It's not a Muslim community, but I raise it because, like the poisoning of Hunter's Point, it relates to an under-addressed area that requires federal intervention, a local issue, a local abuse with local people being harmed, requiring federal intervention because the local officers and officials don't have the jurisdictional power to intervene. Now, that was all like the back half of your question, but the first part around climate crisis and the intersectionality there, I want to just note this is, we've had some interesting victories this week with respect to Indigenous rights and court victories shutting down pipeline projects. And I want to make very explicit the extent to which climate justice and Indigenous rights have always been inextricably interconnected. And also to pause and note our own country's horrific history with respect to Indigenous rights. And it's a history that unfortunately remains ongoing. I want to turn the lens internationally here. And here I'm talking less about climate policy. I'm going back to the military-industrial complex, but also how it connects to climate. So in the last year alone, there have been right-wing coups in 3 Latin American countries: Venezuela, Bolivia, and Brazil. In every single one of them, the events follow a relatively common by now pattern established by the CIA over 70 years. We don't know if the CIA was involved in these right-wing coups. Circumstantial evidence certainly indicates it, including, for instance, the CIA's invitation to the beneficiary of the Brazilian coup to speak at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. This is not a common invitation that foreign heads of state receive. And as a result of the coup there is an ecocide waging unapologetically across the Amazon. Indigenous tribes and communities are being murdered en masse. Deforestation is accelerating. And would that have happened without the CIA's involvement? I don't know. I can't say. It's all hidden behind layers of secrecy, which Nancy Pelosi actively enforces as the agent of she is basically the unilateral arbiter of the House rules. The House rules under her tenure deny every member of Congress, with the exception of a few of her handpicked deputies, access to staff with security clearance. So this is another way in which corporate Democrats are fueling and deferring to the climate crisis, particularly by allowing the military, industrial, extractive democracy killing machine to run amok, not just within the United States as at Standing Rock, but abroad too. Now, just to come all the way back full circle, the essence, the key to ensuring climate justice is to A, keep fossil fuels in the ground, B, transition to a 100% energy, a 100% renewable energy future, and C, ultimately to nationalize fossil fuel companies so that there is not a profit incentive in destroying the future. We incentivize too much behavior that kills people. Fossil fuels are an example of this. A private pharmaceutical industry is an example of this. Weapons manufacturers are an example of this. For-profit prisons, same thing. In each of these arenas, there's no good reason to allow private enterprise. We don't let people sell their votes. Why do we let people sell oil? Nobody today owns it. We pretend that we own it, but nobody here made it. These are natural resources that preceded anyone alive. And the thing that we have to grapple with is that there are future generations who have interests here. They're not here to defend them or be represented. And every drop of oil that we pull out of the ground, we are stealing from the future. We are robbing people that we are supposed to be stewarding resources for. And that's an economic choice. That's a tool of public policy. I'm not willing to stand by as the future is fleeced by a predatory past, and none of us should be willing to tolerate that outcome. Climate justice is one dimension of this. Environmental racism and the toxic siding of extractive industries is another, whether it's guarding the water supply and making sure the people in Flint, Michigan get clean water, whether it's making sure in Southern California that people don't have to live within, spitting distance of an oil well near their school, and whether it's in San Francisco, making sure that people can live in safe neighborhoods where they're not being poisoned by our own national security agency. In each of these instances, to make sure that Black lives matter, or to make sure that Indigenous lives matter, to make sure that lives matter, we need to contain corporate interests and put the interests of future generations that don't have a seat at the table currently in our policy calculus. And I think this is part of your question, was how do we get it passed through Congress? Was that right? The key to that is the jobs guarantee. Historically, measures to advance climate justice have fallen on the shoals of distributive impacts, namely workers that were displaced or would be displaced from fossil fuel industries have their own industrial interests, and they would, with their enterprises, impede those reforms. We need basically coal miners in West Virginia, and we need oil and gas industry participants in Texas. We need them to come along in order for the Green New Deal to pass Congress. And the only way they come along is if they know that the future entails opportunities for them too. That's why the just transition is so important. That's why the jobs guarantee is so important, because it ensures that in the green future, all Americans are included, including the people who might fear the displacement of their economic opportunities from the established industries that we're moving away from. A lot of people have criticized the Green New Deal for being expansive, for including so visionary and economic reform in the context of a vision that purports to be primarily environmental. But there's a genius there, because we can't get the environmental aims if we don't have the industrial restructuring to go with it. And that's just a recognition of the political reality. I think the jobs guarantee is going to unlock any number of opportunities for any number of communities, and it's going to enable any number of climate resiliency projects. One that I often find myself looking forward to is the replication of indigenous forest management techniques here in the West that will take a generation of people, and it will take a ton of labor. And there's absolutely no way for a capitalist framework to mobilize that labor, because there's no profit motive in it. But when we do mobilize those resources to clear our national forests, we're going to reduce our state's vulnerability to the catastrophic wildfires that have destroyed billions of dollars in property and killed dozens of people in each of the last several years. We don't have to deal with that. We can, through public policy, thoughtfully engineer solutions to these predictable, preventable problems.
Thank you so much, Shahid. So I'm going to go to a different topic that is related, kind of bringing up the idea of being, in your words, I think, fleeced. So kind of getting duped by your own government, not having that representation that you voted for, I guess. And on that theme, I'm going to combine
Would you mind if I just got an ice cube? I burned my hand taking something out of the oven right before we started, and it's all melted. I'm just going to I'll be right back. Thank you.
Yeah, and while we're waiting for Shahid, if anyone wants to put more questions in the chat, I noticed there were a few that were dropped in there. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end, and we're also kind of splicing in some of the questions that were submitted in the Google form. So that's just a great time to go ahead and put those questions in the Q&A.
Thank you for bearing with me, Sammy. I appreciate it. I appreciate everyone's patience. Sorry, y'all.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I wanted to combine these two questions, two that are very important to a lot in the Muslim community and just generally in faith communities of faith and organizing communities. But the fact that millions get their health insurance through their employer, the base issue is that millions of people right now are out of work. And part of it's because, the Democrats have been pushing for state-sponsored unemployment programs. The Republicans just want to magically reopen everything during the pandemic. But either way, both those parties, kind of alluding back to what you were saying about that bipartisan authoritarianism, there was a piece that was like, the parties aren't scary in how they differ. They're scary in what they agree on, the policies that they agree on. So to that end, both parties agreed to give the largest bailout in history to a handful of really powerful corporations, and they left working people, generally speaking, out to dry. And so serving that working class, especially working class people of color, many of whom happen to be Muslim, who work these starvation wages and are now clearly at the whim of very large corporations that are very happy to kick them out. What is your plan to make a dysfunctional government or a captured government, whatever you want to describe it, functional again, in your ability as a legislature and your ability as an organizer? And tied to that, an issue that is very near and dear to a lot of people in Muslim spheres, organizing spheres on the left, is Palestine and what's happening right now surrounding annexation, and the intersectional themes it has with what's going on in Kashmir, and all across the world, really. In that now the two-state plan that the Democrats are really kind of hoping for decades is falling apart because the sort of the veil is being pulled back, and that never was really a valid plan when you had thousands of settlements or hundreds of settlements that were dotting the West Bank. And so now that's kind of been pulled back, and we see that, our government doesn't necessarily serve us. It's serving, corporate interests, military interests, you name it, when it comes to the economic piece, when it comes to the foreign policy piece. But sort of how unlike Speaker Pelosi, kind of what is your vision of policy on the economic front and making government functional, especially given the example of Palestine that we're seeing right now and the veil really being pulled off?
So maybe I'll start with Palestine, and then I'll try to get to the broader frame about functional government, because I think those are two obviously very similar but different conversations. Specifically with respect to Palestine, no US resources should ever be given to countries that abuse international human rights. And I mean that specifically with respect not only to Israel, but also Saudi Arabia. I am ecumenical about our construction of human rights abuses, and we should be committed to human rights first, not our perceived geopolitical interests. And one reason I say that is because our national security interests in here in promoting human rights. When we promote our perceived geopolitical interests, we often end up undermining our ultimate national security interests. I would look to, for instance, the CIA's activity in Afghanistan in the 1980s as a principal example here. Our geopolitical interests in the 1980s lay in training Afghan resistance fighters to a Soviet invasion. And after the Soviet Union was gone, those folks got off the leash. And the next thing you knew, we had a new national security threat. The CIA has a habit of training our nation's enemies. I talked before, I'm not sure if it was in this program or I do a lot of these Zooms these days and I forget in which conversation what came up. But did we talk about Gary Webb and the CIA's history of running drugs into the United States? Did that come up yet? People forget these objects of history. Part of the reason that we have paramilitary police and a mass incarceration epidemic in the United States is because the CIA got away with about a decade's worth of drug running into LA and Miami to fund its rogue foreign policy in Latin America and its human rights abuses across the global South. I'm not making this up. Gary Webb documented this in a book, Dark Alliance. It's been memorialized in movies ever since. The CIA has admitted it in the late 90s, yet Congress never followed through. No one at the agency ever went to prison over this. No one at the agency ever lost a program. The agency never suffered any budget consequence. The only thing that happened as a result is 2.5 Black and brown Americans ended up in prison as a result of participating in an underground economy that our national security agency created. So whether it was training Al-Qaeda, whether it was militarily occupying our streets and cities by contriving a effectively national security threat by training and funding narco traffickers. The CIA consistently is in the wrong place. So I just want to note that. And when we look at Palestine, and again, this question of do we put our human rights interests first or our geopolitical interests, whenever we calculate our geopolitical interests, they are always confused. That's the point of that diatribe. Coming back to Palestine, when I went to the West Bank in 2015, I was surprised to discover, but I stayed with a series of families who were olive farmers, and I went there actually with a soap company, Dr. Bronner's Magic Soaps, sources their olive oil from a fair trade organic co-op that it has helped cultivate in the West Bank. And so I had a chance to stay with families in Nablus, in Ramallah, and in Jenin, and to connect with their families and learn about their stories. And in some cases, we connected with their neighbors as well. And I was surprised to discover how little of the issues presented by the occupation are ultimately religious. Here in San Francisco, there's a pretty substantial community of Christian Palestinians. And they will say too that their families suffered the very same attacks that Muslim Palestinians did, which is to say it's not about Islam and Judaism. Islam and Judaism have been in solidarity for 1,000 years. The conflict in Israel and Palestine is about land and resources. It is settler colonialism of the very same sort that typified and characterized and pervaded the westward expansion of the United States and the genocide of Native Americans. And again, I come back here to the need for us to restore human rights and present and protect those first. We shouldn't be supporting apartheid states. We shouldn't be supporting genocides. We shouldn't be funding annexations. Our national security interest inheres in promoting human rights and international law. And those principles are very firmly on the side of frankly, allowing, at the moment, when I look at the West Bank, first stopping the annexation, restoring a right to movement, and allowing basic due process protections that at the moment, Palestinians do not have. We were talking about a military occupation that denies basic human rights. And it's a military occupation in which the US has been complicit for too damn long. And the longer we are complicit in that occupation, the less and less our national security needs are served. And I want to take this even one step further. The national security interests of Israel in promoting human rights. This is a universal shared interest that we have across our various countries in promoting these rights for everyone. And anytime any country places its perceived geopolitical interests in a paramount position, it's not merely the case that it's poisoning the commons. I dare say that it's misconstruing the facts, because these interests in our rights are ones that we all share as a species, regardless of our respective states' parochial interests.
Thank you for that, Shahid. So just to shift topics to thinking about organizing in the face of these calamities, and just a quick time reminder, we have about 5 more minutes, and then we'll go into question and answers from the general public. So oftentimes, young Muslims feel a great sense of frustration in engaging with local leadership about bringing effective change into their communities. And in my town, as Sammy mentioned in my intro, I've been organizing and spearheading an effort going head to head with my local Board of Education on the abysmal ways of addressing racism in our community. So in a town hall that we put together last night, we had speakers and testimonies from our widespread petition that showcased how people from all marginalized backgrounds, but again, primarily Black students, were faced with racial trauma perpetuated in the institutionalized public school infrastructure. So my question is along the lines of, how do you escalate and build these movements within one's local Muslim community when oftentimes said local mosques and Muslims actively prioritize interfaith walks and chai with the sheriff, then showing up for Black organizers such as myself and others who I know are doing similar organizing throughout the country?
Right on. So first, props, sister. I'm so proud of you for doing that organizing work. That's amazing. And that's exactly the kind of example that we need to each emulate. The part of the question where you asked how to mobilize in the mosques and Muslim communities, I have to be honest with you, I don't have a lot of ideas there. As I mentioned before, I basically organize outside the Muslim community because I'm tired of how intimidated it is. I know Muslims as intimidated, timid communities, and it's not our fault. The government went after us. right? Pretty viciously. I mean, I can tell a story. I appear very briefly at the end of a documentary called Terror, with the T in parentheses, error. And it's footage of a press conference I spoke at the National Press Club in 2011, I believe it was. And basically we had called this press conference to feature a voice of a Muslim convert who had been intimidated by the FBI, which had tried to coerce him into becoming an informant and basically entrapping people into fake terror plots that the FBI initiated. And he was going to come to the press conference to blow the whistle, talk about how the FBI had threatened him and his family and tried to force him to basically spy and concoct false charges on his neighbors. And he was arrested by the FBI the night before the press conference and charged with a gun possession offense. And this, I can understand why our community is intimidated. This is the predictable result of discriminatory law enforcement and intelligence gathering. It silences communities. It kills democracy. I don't particularly relate to the world as a Muslim. I relate to the world as an activist and an advocate. And I am a Muslim, but I organize outside and well beyond Muslim communities. And so I'd say to anybody who's interested in these issues, put your ear to the ground and see who else is concerned in your neighborhood with those issues and show up to support them. The work that you were doing last night, mobilizing in the school board, I'm sure that implicated the interests of people beyond Muslims, and those allies are the ones that we need. If we look to other Muslims as our exclusive zones of allies, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. It's not a bad place to start. If you have allies from the masjid or the MSA or whatever community you're a part of, start there by all means. But don't look exclusively to our own communities for your allies. I think the essence in gaining influence is to recruit allies beyond our established communities. Last night here in San Francisco, there was a Board of Supervisors hearing it was a budget hearing about the SFPD. And a whole number of groups, including DSA San Francisco, a new group, Defund, SFPD Now, I think Strike Ready SF, a group of teachers in the community were also involved. They mobilized. We had public comment that went on for something like 12 hours. And by the time I gave my comment, it was almost midnight. And this hearing started at 2:30 in the afternoon. And the entire Board of Supervisors heard in no uncertain terms, thousands of members of the community are clamoring to defund the police and invest in better alternatives to secure public safety. That took organizing, and organizing is where the action is at. Just to break that down, 9/10 of organizing is just showing up. There's so many voices in your community that have long preceded any one of us that have been working on these issues and just showing up to learn the history, because you're not going to get the history in a book necessarily. You're not necessarily going to find it online. But somebody who's been in your community, who's been showing up to the meetings for 10 years, they'll give you the history, and you're going to learn layers of it that, again, you're not going to find written anywhere. Showing up and meeting people. I want to also just reinforce the importance of people in our struggles. One of the most profound acts of politics, of envisioning a brighter future, of building the new in the shell of the old, of shrugging off the yoke of our stale corporate past, one of the most important things we can do is make introductions. Introductions are incredibly powerful. People are our greatest resource in this world. And to connect people with common interests or common geography or some synergy in their organizing projects, I'm grateful for the chance that's kind of what I do as an organizer, but I'm grateful for the chance to have brought any number of people together. And that's what we can each do by keeping our ear to the ground and just showing up and see who's working on what. There's an essence of liberatory praxis that looks like examining your own privileges to identify them, acknowledge them, and then redeploy them. And whether that's educational privilege, whether that's a demographic privilege, whether that's a geographic privilege, we all have privileges. And it can be an object of active exploration to figure out what they are. But if we do actively embrace that opportunity, I think that's a part of this puzzle of building local organizations. The last thing I'll say here is to emphasize locality. We are all increasingly in an age of the internet inclined to think global, and that's important. We can't take our eye off the ball of the next step, and that is to act locally. We have to take some action, or it's all just hot air. And tweeting is not an action. Social media is maybe important. I think it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not enough. It's insufficient. Taking local action is the essence of everything that actually functionally matters. And if we limit ourselves to thinking globally and acting digitally, we have failed the call of the moment. And I do think that showing up, meeting your neighbors, finding common cause, and discussing what to do together is very much at the core of the need that confronts us. If I may say one thing, if we're going to pivot to Q&A, I might just invite my colleague, Deba, to jump in to share with people just how they can get involved in our campaign to the extent folks are interested in helping us liberate the 12th Congressional District seat.
Yeah, that was actually the next question about running for office and how young people get involved, especially Muslims right now.
Okay.
But yeah, Adiba, I don't know if you're here.
Yes, I'm here. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Adiba. I'm an organizer with the campaign, with Shahid's campaign. I'm one of your fellow Muslim American peers. And like Shahid, I'm also from the Midwest, but a little different, a little more south. I'm from Oklahoma. And this conversation has made me think just how 5 years ago, I didn't really believe Muslim Americans to really be a serious voting bloc, to be like a community that has actually any political power. And 2016 changed that. 2018 really changed that when we saw like Ilhan and Rashida come into power. And I think particularly this year, I really felt the full force of like, no, Muslims are a really serious political community that can enact a tremendous change. Before joining Shahid's campaign, I was an organizer for the Bernie campaign. And I have never seen across all generations, Muslims who are old, young, middle-aged come out for Bernie like no other. People at the masajid, people at school, whatever. I just have never seen it before. And it's one of the most beautiful things. And, if today Shahid's message resonates with you, if it does, then we can get him into the seat that we want. And I think like we have, of course, I live by a train, so we're gonna has to come right now, but that's okay. There's around like 50 people on this call and like couple more hundred on the live streams. And so if everyone, made 50 or like 100 calls, we can reach like 10,000 people. So, again, if this is something of interest to you, if you feel moved, we have to keep the momentum that's already started. And so we can deliver Shahid that stunning upset. And the way to do that is I'm going to drop it in the chat. It's shahid.fyi/volunteer. And just for everyone on the live stream, again, it's shahid.fyi/volunteer. So yes, if you want to help, we can, get Shahid that stunning upset. And that is my field pitch.
Thank you so much, Adiba. Yeah, so that was the question, was like, how can young people get involved in campaigns like this and like others? There's people like Nabila Islam in Georgia. There's campaigns like this all across the country that are really trying to change people's lives and transform like the country and our presence in the world. And actually, it's very interesting that you bring up working on the campaign and like interacting with Muslim communities. When I was in, something you said, Shahid, reminded me of when I was in Vegas, the Las Vegas strip casino caucuses. One of them was won exclusively by a Black Muslim who literally, followed Tom Steyer, one of the candidates. He followed his daughter, who gave a speech and almost flipped everybody to her side. And this taxi cab driver just came out and started talking about his story. And it wasn't about Bernie. It wasn't he was a man of faith. It was about what he wanted to see in his community change. And he said that, I want to see this change in my community. And I believe that we elect this person. It's not like he's going to deliver it magically, but we're going to push them and they're going to show up for us. And that's the kind of contract we agree to. And, this Black Muslim cab driver, who I don't believe was a man of much means, ended up, winning an entire casino by a wide margin. So I think the narrative we're taught that, a single voice doesn't have power is not true. And more so when we collectively organize, we have like far, far greater amount of ability to actually change the world around us. And actually, Shahid, I think the Providence bill that you were referring to earlier, I think it is under attack right now, actually, because one of the groups that was set up as a independent investigator of the police here recently has been denied body camera footage, and the police chief is just kind of dangling their cooperation over the independent group's head. So, it's a constant fight, is all that I meant to say about that. I'm based in Providence. So,
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no. And, I guess now moving into our Q&A questions, I want to lighten the mood for a second. And this can be a really quick answer, but this is something that was sent in that I just found funny. And I share with some folks, but it's something that I kind of alludes to the political moment we're in of fear and something leading to fascism, if not fascism completely. But so do you think the Trump administration proposing the ban on TikTok because they're not able to regulate its political content, do you think it's because they're worried that the largest voting bloc, aka young people, are starting to congregate together? And I guess that question, and then are there ways that you're harnessing that kind of collective power through social media effectively, not just people tweeting, but actually taking action?
Yeah.
And maybe 1 or 2 minutes per question if possible, so we can get through a lot of them.
Okay, that's a lot to bite off in 1 or 2 minutes, but I'll take the latter half of it rather than the TikTok piece. So yeah, we're seeing a great deal of impact from social media support and people organizing online using social media to support our campaign. So for instance, every week there's a video conference. It's on Mondays at 5 p.m. If you're interested, write to us at info@shahidforchange.us. We'd love to get you involved. And that's volunteers from around the country who come together to, for instance, they're planning a tweet storm. If I'm not mistaken, the date is July 12th. I'm not sure of the precise time. I think it's 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. And they'll be working to promote on both Twitter and Instagram, expanding awareness of our campaign. They also organize any number of other things. For instance, there's a Youth for Shahid collective and a People for Shahid. These are grassroots groups run by supporters with supporters, and run by supporters with supporters from all kinds of places. I can think of particularly, there's a very active European teenager in the climate justice movement who's active in one of our online groups. And I'm grateful for the chance to see that sensibility among young people emerge on our campaign. I want to take it offline though too. Last weekend for Independence Day, I basically spent the entire weekend at a series of block parties with youth-led Movement for Black Lives protests around the city. On Saturday, July 4th, we started at City Hall with climate justice action co-organized by Extinction Rebellion and Code Pink, and had a chance to be on the roof of a van and a mobile sound system tooling through the city, chanting defund police and the Pentagon all morning. And then we did an empty chair debate at Nancy Pelosi's house. And we ended up in a block party all afternoon and evening with a bunch of Latinx youth in the Mission who organized a block party and marched back to City Hall where we started that morning. That's all youth led. It's all offline. And so I just want to distinguish, people equate youth and online a lot. I'm just wanting to peel them apart. Youth-led efforts, many of them are online, a lot of them are not. And some of the realest work doesn't have the internet involved at all. And I'm proud, as I said at that action last week, to be a representative of social movements led by youth.
Thank you for that answer. So a question that came in our Q&A is reflecting on Angela Davis' quotes that's somewhere along the lines of radical means grasping things at the root. So if you could name the root of problems in society in your own perspective, what would you say that is? And try to keep it short, but definitely interested to hear your thoughts.
The love of capital. I'm embracing the brevity invitation here.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I think Siham, do you have a question? I don't know if you have one ready. If not, I can pull one right now.
Yes, someone from the audience is asking, how would you teach tolerance to Americans hostile towards Islam?
Tolerance, I think, is a value that it has an interesting valence relative to our national ethos. I think tolerance is a pretty thin commitment. And I would like to see us get beyond tolerance to open embracing. And I think the key to getting anybody to embrace our communities is simply to show up in solidarity. All of our communities have neighbors. And if you show up in solidarity for your neighbors, they tend to show up in solidarity back. I mean, that's kind of what it's about. I think that, I'd particularly praise, for instance, here the work of the Ummah Clinic. This is a organization that, animated by Muslim values is giving away healthcare treatment and medical services for free. That sort of community service is a piece of this puzzle and a piece of gaining acceptance. I think a lot of it also is generational transition. When we talk about the acceptance of Muslims, I think I see in younger people a much more demographically fluid and diverse set of social networks than the ones that characterized, for instance, our parents. And I think that in that social networking, and I don't mean Facebook posts here, I mean just like people connecting and having friends and building networks, that is a form of community diplomacy. And so another way to put that is there's an invitation and an opportunity, I think, for each of us who live in particularly multiracial spaces to be active in making multiracial friends. And I think that that over time has a lot to do with this. There's also a piece of this that goes to, this is one of the reasons I'm running for office. I'm a Muslim running for office, not to vindicate the rights of Muslims, but to defend the rights of Americans. And for me, part of the reason I'm doing that, frankly, is because as a canary in the coal mine, I've seen in sharp relief a set of issues that many other people, perhaps by virtue of their own respective privileges, haven't had an opportunity to see. And I'm doing that work in solidarity with my neighbors. So it's kind of a few different points of, pieces of this discussion, but I aim very much to represent a constitutional voice for Muslims, one that, frankly, I've seen my voice at least resonate with any number of conservatives. And it's precisely because they might look at me as a socialist, they might look at me as a Muslim, but one of the other things they look at me as is an ally. And I think that that's a critical step to building bridges and expanding the support for our communities and each other.
Thank you so much, Shahid. So we actually just got permission from Derek and Adiba to have you on for a little bit longer.
Okay.
So we want to keep asking questions from the audience. And one question that I got from a personal friend of mine was kind of an interesting one, because I don't know if it's necessarily like substantive, but it's really thought-provoking, because the question is, when the thought popped into your head of, I'm going to challenge Nancy Pelosi, what were you thinking? Because that's not a light decision. And the reason why I asked is because I think that is the sort of motivational, like, thought process that a lot of people need, because some of these systems that a lot of the people on this call maybe even are fighting against are not, they seem impenetrable and overwhelming. So I guess run us through that really quickly if you can. First thing that kind of pops in your head.
Well, the first thing is not the end of the story, it's just the beginning. But the first time I said it, I didn't mean it at all. Frankly, it wasn't the object of serious inquiry. I blurted it out because I was so angry because she was voting against a proposed surveillance reform that I'd spent 10 years working on. And I said, F this ish. It makes me want to quit my job and run against her. That was what I basically blurted out in a crowded room. And there were people in the room who I respect. And one of them in particular immediately, without missing a beat, and then the rest of them all said, I'd vote for you. And as they said that, it frankly forced me to reckon with the implication of my own words. Like, again, it started as a joke, and it took several weeks for that insinuation to take root. I thought about it after that. And, there was a particular, I think it's Georgia O'Keeffe, who presents creativity as a thing that is not ours to withhold from the world. This actually aligns with a very Muslim perspective. Like we have our gifts entrusted, I think, to whether it's our families or, things beyond us. And I don't think it's for us to deny the world the benefit of our various gifts. And so thinking of that, the next set of things that came to mind for me were just power mapping and assessing the communities in San Francisco and the work I'd done. And, I've long been frustrated with San Francisco's representation by a relative conservative. This is a proud progressive city. I love it very deeply. And ever since I was a student here, I've been frustrated by San Francisco being represented by a conservative vote in Congress. In 2018, when I was looking at this seat and, chewing on this experience I had with my allies and colleagues, one of the things that occurred to me was I have the receipts to crack her coalitions, right? So I ran a national nonprofit for 6 years. I know how to talk to media. I know how to coach a staff. I know how to develop policy. I know how to monitor a budget. I did work on gay rights in 2004 when she refused to show up for my gay neighbors. The gay community is a very pivotal one in San Francisco. I've put my body on the line to try to stop wars that she voted to fund. I tried to stop deportations that she's enabled. I kind of looked at the history and I noticed that I basically had all the receipts to break her coalition. And so after it being an excited utterance that led to a sort of discomforting processing of the insinuation of this experience I had with my colleagues, I sat down and I looked at it, and it ultimately came down to this: no one else who I thought could do it would do it. And at that point, it basically, sort of comes down to, if not you, who? And if not now, when? And these cycles repeat. Your kids will face it again unless you do something about it. And, I wasn't willing to just stand aside and let the train sort of continue to roll on amok. The last thing I'd say here is that when I did start closely looking at it, I want to just lay out some opportunities for people. People ask me every day, like, what does it take to run for office? If you're interested in running for office, I would just invite you to rewind first, because you shouldn't be looking to run for office. No one should want to run for office. It's not fun. There's a huge privilege implicit in it, but it is a grind. And if you're interested in it, do the hard work first. Learn how to organize. If you want to run for office, be an organizer first. And once you've done something, run for office after you've organized something. That's useful. And I think the key to that is to find a local issue, find some neighbors, and organize. It's just the same thing I was talking about before. Practice civic engagement. It is a practice. Be a hyper citizen. Develop your everything from ability to connect with people, to make introductions, to speak in public. Do all those things. And as you build those capacities and those skill sets, you'll expand your network naturally just by using those skills and showing solidarity. Showing solidarity is the key. It's the essence. However you do it, just do that. And it will create opportunities as you go. For me, it was showing solidarity, with gay people 15, 20 years ago. It was showing solidarity with the people of Iraq over the course of that era. It was showing solidarity with the survivors and victims of civil liberties abuses that, drove me to do the work at the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and the years since. Showing solidarity will develop your skills. It will expand your networks. It will deepen your understanding of the issues. And I should pause there too, with respect to deepening your understanding of the issues and expanding your audience. Another critical opportunity there is to write for a public audience. I started writing for a public audience around 2005, initially for Huffington Post and then for Truth Out. I highly, highly recommend public writing for a couple different reasons. First, it forces you to learn. There is no more granular way to learn something than to try to teach it. And that's ultimately what writing is it forces you to teach. For me, one of the most critical audiences as I try to teach is my own future self. Most of the things I've written over the course of my life are at any given point in time lost to me. That's why I wrote them. So you can think of your writing as basically like establishing your own body of researchable work for yourself, if not for others. And if you do this over time, it can create a track record, a history of your thoughts as they relate to different issues. Since I've been running against Pelosi, I've had the opportunity to reflect on any number of things I've had a chance to write over the years, from my recommendations for better counterterrorism policy, which I wrote in 2008, to my recommendations to how to fix the Supreme Court, which I wrote in 2010, how to effectuate radical wealth redistribution through a market framework. I wrote that paper in 2000, or how to recover the Bill of Rights and our constitutional commitments from a bipartisan authoritarianism we've been talking about. And I wrote about that in 2015. In each of these different areas, writing for a public audience and organizing are the two most important praxis that I would recommend as a preparation for running for public office. Again, if you're running for public office, do the hard work first. Organize, write. Those are the best ways you can prepare yourself for the various parts that the role requires.
Thank you so much. That was such a great answer. I think Siham has a question, then we're going to go to Sirad, and then I'm going to close this out so we don't keep you for too long.
Yes. Are you optimistic about a progressive coalition in the House in 2020 pressuring Democrats on key issues?
I am. And I would reframe it. I don't think we'll be pressuring Democrats. I think we'll be dictating to Democrats which way they're going to go. When I replace Pelosi, the signal it will send across the body politic will be louder than, frankly, any other we've heard in the recent past. People might remember how big a deal it was when the number 3 Democrat went down to my predecessor, Ocasio-Cortez, when I joined her and Ilhan Omar and the rest of the squad in Washington after having taken out the leading corporate Democrat. The rest of the Democrats are going to get a very simple message. It goes like this: you will either show up for our communities or we will show you the door. So we're not going to be influencing the Democrats. We will be leading the Democrats in an entirely new direction, one aligned with and allied with our communities instead of Wall Street.
Thank you. And one quick last question. So someone dropped this in the form that we submitted earlier. So any book recommendations or introductory literature about government instigated aggression in our own communities? So just like drop some book links, suggestions, so that young Muslims can start thinking about this and learning.
Word. It's one of my favorite questions, actually, and I appreciate whoever raised it. I always start book recommendations with Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. Critical read. It will change your perspective of a great many things. It's an accessible history, and it reframes what history is. So both methodologically and from a substantive perspective, could not recommend any work of history more highly. There's a book I found very revealing with respect to the contemporary Fangs of the Military Industrial Complex, Talons of the Eagle by Stephen Miller, explores particularly the history of US interventions in Latin America. Dark Alliance by Gary Webb in the same vein. The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein is an important read. It helps unpack how Wall Street takes advantage of social crises around the world to implement austerity measures. It's very much the same playbook that the conservative, Republican, and Democratic caucuses are running here in the United States today. Nancy Pelosi's track record appears very different in light of the light cast by Naomi Klein's inquiry. So the Shock Doctrine can do a lot to expose the sort of corruption and vacuousness of our American political system. Other books, I'm a big fan of Lawrence Lessig's work. He was my professor when I was a student at Stanford, and his thinking around the various ways in which the components of social rules intersect, that is to say law and code and architecture and norms, that has been very influential for me. His latest book, They Don't Represent Us, particularly examines the phenomenon of money in politics and the various other ways in which our democracy has become unmoored from the rule of the governed. Those are just a few of the books that I would recommend, and certainly invite anybody to start with any of those titles. I think they're all really important. Shoshana, I'm going to mess her last name up. She wrote Surveillance Capitalism. Her last name starts with a Z, if I'm not mistaken. She also has a really important work. And maybe the last one I'd throw out here is Ryan Grimm's We Got People, is an important book of recent political analysis that is quite revealing.
Yeah, thank you so much for all that. Yeah, I think just to close this out, I mean, it's very rare to find someone, just generally speaking, who's running for office, who's willing to kind of engage in these issues very critically, and to be open to criticism and to expect sort of, and I think this ties back to your organizer mentality, but I guess in the closing, I personally, and I'm sure a lot of people on the call, would encourage you to keep approaching public office as not a right, but as something that you must earn those votes. And I hope today you've gone a certain way in earning more votes and winning people over to your side, because once we're there, we're going to expect a lot from you. Even if you're not my representative, but hopefully you will get in the House. Speaking personally, my political opinion. But I think a lot of people today hopefully took away a lot from this talk in, challenging the status quo and not being content with systems that have been in place for a long time, but don't necessarily serve anybody except for a select few. But with that, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our moderators, chat moderators. Thank you to Adiba and Derek, everyone involved. And thank you so much, Shahid, for being here today. We will be I think maybe hopefully we can stay on for a minute and redrop the sign up link to get involved with your campaign. So maybe we can keep the Zoom open for like a minute or two extra. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for coming. Maybe we can actually, as folks leave, as you hop off, we can have people, unmute and have a little huddle post. But appreciate you so much for coming. I think this was, I love this event, and I hope we can do more like it in the future.
Right on. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the forum and all the questions and all the work. I can only imagine all the work that's happening on the ground and all the places that people are plugging in from, but I can't wait to see all of it. So whatever you all are doing in your various communities, please keep it up. we need all of it. And thank you so much for giving me the chance to connect with people. I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, thanks so much. Assalamu alaikum.